Michael Wood, thank you for your time. You're now exiled to London, but you're from the Northwest. Do you miss Manchester?
Yes, I do miss Manchester. And I always enjoy going back there. And I feel terribly at home there, you know, coming in on the train from Stockport and passing those, the rows of red brick houses in Levenshulme and everything. I sort of breathe a sigh out, you know, so I still have that vestigial feeling, if you know what I mean. In fact, I was filming in Moss Side only about 3 weeks ago, you know, so Great Western Street, Moss Lane East, and Eel Place School, and you know, the Curry Mile and everything. And I really enjoyed just walking around. While the crew were taking some general shots, I wandered around the little entries around the back streets where I used to play as a kid. You know, beautiful sunlight was exactly the same. That's the weird thing after all these years.
In your current series, Great British Story, People's History, you've covered some islands. You've been to the church in Govan, Scotland, Ulster, Northumbria. The northwest of England has played a pivotal part in the history of Britain through its connections with the Industrial Revolution. How would you characterise the contribution made by the northwest, Liverpool and Manchester in particular? And of course you're going to be objective, besides the fact that you're from Manchester.
Absolutely.
And you're scholarly objective answers.
Yes. Well, you know, our country has played a role in history, in the history of the world, out of all proportion to its size, really. And you look at the great cultures of the world, like India and China, of course, and the Mediterranean world. England was just a tiny island off the fringe of Europe, you know, 1550, we had 3 million people maybe, so tiny, insignificant. And yet its role has been huge. The language and the literature, the language has become the world language. We became the workshop of the world, as well as having an empire. And obviously the empire was in part won by force as well as by persuasion. So there's goods and bads about empires, no question. But within that story, the story of the Northwest is a very powerful story. We're sitting here in Liverpool looking out over the Mersey, you know, and it's almost a theatre of history here, with the great Victorian buildings and St George's Hall and the docks, and you really feel the power of history, the role that it had not only in the commerce of the world but in the slave trade. You know, these are great issues in our history. Manchester in particular, and I'm not just saying this because I'm from Manchester, but really is one of the great cities in the history of the world, I think, and it's because of its role in the formation of our modern world in terms of ideas, it seems to me. I was taking my younger daughter around Manchester University last year. She was looking for which university to go to, and I said, "Oh, I've got to pop into Mosley Street and look at not only the paintings, but look at the Manchester History Gallery." And there you see the Independent Labour Party with its Manchester roots, the Co-op with its Manchester roots, the suffragettes, you know, the women's liberation movement with Manchester roots, the Chartists, Peterloo, free trade, you know, the role of Manchester in history, and as the first industrial city in the history of the world. You know, it was the first time in the history of the world that a population had come into a great city to be a manufacturing and labouring class, really. And I think that it played a tremendous role.
Given that Liverpool is a port city, Manchester is not, would have expected the Industrial Revolution to take place in Liverpool more so than Manchester.
You might, and Liverpool and Manchester are inextricably bound together despite their rivalries. Liverpool was the great port, it was the great outlet for the Manchester cotton trade, the bringing cotton in, taking out the manufacture and so on. So the two are tied together. But it's also their social and you know, organisational histories, really. It's interesting that Liverpool was quite strongly controlled by powerful owners and manufacturers and powerful merchants, and you know, it's interesting that Liverpool was a city that slavery was very important to the economy of Liverpool. Manchester was the great fighter in the anti-slavery movement, you know. You know, there was those peculiar conditions of the cotton trade, especially with the you know, the waters, very soft water in Manchester coming down from the Pennines and so on, that led to it becoming that. And it was such a phenomenon, with such a huge population coming into the city over such a short time in the early 19th century, that people from all over the world came to look at it, you know, foreign observers, writers, de Tocqueville, the greatest of all theorists about the kind of modern revolutions, France and America, he came to Manchester and he observed it and wrote about it. Novelists, you know, Disraeli, Mrs. Gaskell, Dickens' Hard Times, Mrs. Gaskell's North and South. Everybody went to Manchester and saw it as a phenomenon of the age. Engels, you know, Frederick Engels was the son of a factory owner. He was a young German, handsome young guy in his 20s when he's writing this stuff, you know, looked a bit like the young Boris Becker, you know, fell in love with an Irish patriot, Mary Burns, who initiated him into the squalor and the horrors of ordinary people's lives. And he wrote about these places like Little Ireland on the Medlock, or the Angel Meadow, the great slum in Ancoats, which was hell on earth. Engels said, you know, the worst slum of the age. And so everybody saw Manchester as a laboratory of the industrial age, you see. So it had a great impact on the world, and it's and of course there's somebody brought up, you know, post-war. You know, I'm a child of the 50s and the 60s, and the Manchester Guardian and the liberal tradition and the Halley Orchestra and the football and the cricket. You know, it's still you know, the sport was a creation of that industrial age too. You know, and as everybody knows, Manchester's the football capital of the world.
And not Liverpool. We won't mention that last week.
Well, Liverpool's got great traditions too.
Back to the Great British Story. I've only seen 2 episodes, so it's still in the middle, that's the beginning of its run. A lot of the aerial visuals have a peculiar perspective. Instead of the usual London down at the bottom and Scotland at the top, we've turned the whole thing upside down, and now we have London at the top of the screen and Blackpool, which is only on the left. Was that obviously a deliberate choice? Was that in part to get us to look at ourselves from a very different perspective?
I think so. I mean, we've had 1 or 2 criticisms from English nationalists on the website saying, well, history of England's more important. But of course, in the first centuries of our story, the English are a tiny minority, and the British world, from Scotland and across, you know, to the west and all that, is the most important part of the story. And when you look at it from that point of view, turning the map round is always very interesting. And you turn the map round in this part of the world, and you know, you look at the Irish Sea, and if you turn that map round, say that Dublin's at the bottom and Liverpool and Manchester at the top, and Wales is over to the right and the south of Scotland over to the left, and you look at that map and you see that the Irish Sea is almost like an inland sea, you know, and you understand why the Northwest has much more intensive contacts until very recent times, really, with Scotland and Ireland and Wales, than it did with the southeast and London. You know, that our world as South Lancashire people is bounded by that kind of circle, I always feel, you know. And you've only got to look at the football teams and all the characters. You know, I always say, you know, a typical music group, Lennon, McCartney, Starkey, Harrison. You know, a typical bunch of comedians, Askey, Tarbuck, O'Connor, you know, a typical bunch of footballers, Carragher, you know, Keane, Finnan, Gerrard. These names show you this link of Scotland, Ireland, the Northwest. That's what's made this culture. You know, in a town like Liverpool, there's nobody who isn't an immigrant.
It's interesting. The working class, it's a people's history. The working class community that arose through the Industrial Revolution. Arguably, they have many achievements under their belts, not least the raising of the quality of life for the poverty-stricken people of the time, the slums you mentioned earlier, and the great movements of the co-op and the cooperative movement and the unions. How do you think those achievements of the working people of Britain stack up against the achievements elsewhere through music, art and literature?
Well, you know, we've been a very creative and inventive culture and society over many hundreds of years. Even now, you see, we look at ourselves and everybody's a bit sort of conscious of the fact that Britain no longer has the status it did in the world. Yeah. Look at these great inventions. We were just talking today about the kind of DNA fingerprinting and the internet, the DNA discovery of DNA itself. So many great discoveries and inventions still have come out of our society, and through history it's been very creative and inventive. And no question, you know, all these fields, literature, music, poetry, they're great. We're in Liverpool. The Beatles, to name but one, have had such a profound influence on the culture of the world, you know, and will continue to do that. We're very, very great songwriters, and so one should. All I'm saying is that you can view history from the point of view of the rulers, and we can make films about Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and they're very interesting, you know. But the truth is that our society was built by the people, and that the achievements of the people in terms of democracy and stuff like that, our rights and our freedoms, have come from the bottom, pushing up, not from the top, beneficently giving them. Do you know what I mean? And those exist very, very early on. You know.
But there's one historical factor that the phenomenon of the people's history being given a recognition never had before.
I think. Certainly since my student days, end of the 60s, early 70s, there's been a lot of interest in the social history of Britain. You know, and E.P. Thompson in my day wrote The Making of the English Working Class and stuff like that, you know. And I think there's much more interest in that, and also the probing of documents, you know, the documents for the ordinary people are incredibly rich, going back over 800 years, and all that's being kind of sifted now. But the biggest thing, I think, is public interest. You know, it's a democratic kind of thing. History is the biggest leisure participation activity in the UK. You know, more people actually are involved in National Trust, English Heritage, museum visits than in any other activity. We all kind of care about these things, you see. And the biggest interest of all, you can see from these events today, is in family history. You know, who are we? Who am I? Where do I come from? What's my relationship to my community and my place? My village, my suburb, my town, my city, and how does that connect with the history of the nation? And multiple identities are perfectly possible now, you see, as you know yourself, Yuri, you know. I mean, I was talking the other day to somebody in the street in Manchester who was a Sikh who wore a turban, you know, so still an observing Sikh. And in a strong Manchester accent, he said, "Well, I'm a Sikh first, but I'm really a Mancunian, you know. And of course, I'm red rather than blue. And yes, I'm all right, I'm English. Yes, English. Well, I'm British as well. You know, you think that's an extraordinary phenomenon. Now, in other countries, India, for example, multiple identities are very, very common. You know, I'm Tamil, I'm Muslim, I'm Indian, and I suspect to a degree that's been so in England. But there's been a very strong centralising culture in England, which you've never had in India, for example. And that's breaking up now, and the pride in these regional and local identities has really become quite intense, and it's fun. You know, it's really great fun.
It's terrific to be in the 21st century. Finally, July 1961, you were a schoolboy in Manchester. And on the 12th of July, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin came to visit Manchester. What recollections do you have of the day?
Well, I remember it because, some schools who were on his route, because I think he flew into Ringway Airport, didn't he? Were actually allowed to go out and see him go past, which was absolutely incredible. Now, I was at Bench Hill, and we didn't do that, but I knew all about it from my mum and dad and my aunts and my uncles. He visited Metro Vickers, and because my dad's family came from Austin, and my granddad worked at Metro Vickers and all that, there was a great interest in all this. And you've got to remember what a star he was at that time. It was an extraordinary piece of news that over all that gap of time, anybody who lived through it, you can't forget what a moment, what a revelation that moment was. And there was something marvellous about it, because we were taught to sort of fear the Russians at that time. You know, there really was a Cold War climate of fear. And here he was, this very charming young man. He seemed so young, and he seemed so jolly, and he seemed so affable. That was the key thing when you saw it on telly in the evening. You know, and everybody said who'd gone to Albert Square that day, that Albert Square was absolutely packed. You know, and the idea, people were perching everywhere to see this guy, and I thought that the sheer almost affection and interest and sociability of the Manchester public People were just compellingly interested by this guy, and he reciprocated. That was what everybody said. And he understood us as Mancunians, you know, as working people. We were so proud of ourselves as a workshop of the world and a place of engineering and industry. And here was a guy whose origin, I think, wasn't he a
foundry worker?
Foundry worker.
Certainly had a working class.
And I remember my granddad saying, "Oh, he understands us." You know, there was some incident that happened about where he showed his knowledge. I can't remember what it was, and everybody was very kind of pleased that day. And it was almost as if Mancunians felt there was a bond there that cut through all the Cold War stuff and showed that we were people together. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's what they loved about him. And certainly among my parents and uncles and my granddad, there was a real appreciation of that village. I never understood at the time why he'd chosen Manchester. What the most extraordinary thing was, I can't remember whether he'd even visited anywhere else at that point.
He had.
But to come to Manchester, and Manchester responded with this. I mean, Albert Square was when you saw the Manchester Evening News reporting it the next day, it was just unbelievable. You know, it was like the only time I can remember that was ever like that in my day was when United won the European Cup. You know, I mean, there've been more events since, but it was like that, and that said something about the Manchester public, I thought.
I don't want to overstay my welcome. Thank you very much indeed, Mark.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.